Hello and welcome everyone. Today we are going to take a look at Baldur's Gate 3, and specifically we're going to talk about what you need to know in order to create a character ready for release. So first up, let's talk about the roles. In Dungeons & Dragons, there are a few non-combat roles that you need to consider. So there's the Face, the Scout, and the Specialist. The Face is someone who's generally the person with a high charisma that's going to be at the front of the party, and they're the face of the party. They deal in persuasion, deception, and intimidation. There's a lot of classes that can do this, but they're generally the character in most situations you're going to want to have leading conversations. Another factor you want to consider is having a Scout. So a Scout is a character that generally specializes in dexterity. Once again, lots of classes can do this, and they're going to focus on stealth, traps, lockpicking, that sort of thing. And finally, a specialist, which is any character that can take some sort of skill proficiency to an extreme level. And they're going to be useful in various situations to solve sort of non-combat problems and give you access to potentially alternate paths that you wouldn't otherwise have access to. And almost every class has some sort of way they can specialize in certain skills. In terms of combat roles, there are quite a few different roles you can take on in a game like Dungeons & Dragons, and here's a general modified list that I've kind of come up with. There's a frontline, the striker, and the blaster. These are generally your damage dealing roles. And then you have the support, the controller, and the healer, which are sort of non-damage focused roles in combat. So in terms of the frontliner, these are characters that are durable, they do a lot of melee damage, and they like to get in on the front line. Next, the striker. Usually these are characters that can deal significant damage to a single target, and this might be both at ranged or in melee. And finally, the blaster. The blaster oftentimes is a spellcaster, and these focus on dealing high damage in a large area of effect. So classes that can throw fireballs, for example. In terms of the non-damage focused combat roles, you have the support, which generally focuses on buffing and debuffing. So classes that can give attack bonuses or armor bonuses to their allies, damage bonuses, things like haste, giving extra attacks, all that good stuff is a supporting role. There is the controller, which generally focuses on large area of denial or area of effect abilities, things like web or fog cloud. Once again, often these are spellcasters that are focusing on controlling and manipulating the battlefield. And finally, healers, which is a pretty big umbrella term, but really it's just any class that can provide any sort of healing, and many classes can do this to varying degrees. So now that we've given an overview of the roles, let's take a look at our first class, and we're going to go through this list in alphabetical order, so you can skip ahead if you would like to look at a particular class. So first up, we have the Barbarian. The Barbarian fills a clear frontline role with definite striker capabilities as well. Barbarians do a lot of damage, and they can do a lot of damage per round. And the nice thing about a Barbarian is when their rage is rolling, they're hitting hard, they're hitting consistently, it's going to last for the entire fight, and they are tanky. One of the cons I would say for the Barbarian is they are a little bit one-dimensional. You're not going to have a master tactician playing a Barbarian, or they're going to get pretty bored. Generally speaking, they're an incredibly effective class, but they're definitely one-dimensional. Next up, we have the Bard. The Bard is one of my personal favorite classes, and the Bard is a bit of a jack of all trades and can perform many roles. Because charisma is one of their defining attributes, they make an excellent face, and arguably one of the best faces in the game. They're going to be the type of character you have in the front lines talking to everyone. So they are great for that, but they also often use dexterity as a secondary stat, meaning they make excellent scouts, and because of their perks and spells, they also are really good specialists. They are great out of combat. They have so many ways to deal with so many different skills, and they get expertise and bonuses, so they can really pump their skill checks to levels that other classes just cannot compete with. And on top of that, they are a full spellcaster in this edition of Dungeons & Dragons, meaning they have lots of great ways to buff their powers even further through magic. In terms of combat, Bards play a great supporting role as well as controller. They have spells that deal area of effect damage. They have spells that can support and buff their allies. They're also a healer. They are probably weakest in sort of a frontline or striker role, but in the right circumstances, you can be a bit of a blaster. Lower bards get access to any spell they want at level 6, meaning that you're going to be able to throw fireballs with the best of them. So bards are a great class if you're looking to fill out any role in the game, and especially those non-combat roles. They are one of the best classes if you're looking to kind of explore in every single nook and cranny, get all the dialogue options you can. Fantastic class. Obviously, a con is they're maybe a little bit squishy compared to a lot of other classes, and they're not going to be the king of dealing damage or being tanky. Next up, we have the Cleric. Another one of my favorite classes. Clerics are incredibly versatile. Unlike the Bard, a Cleric is maybe going to be a little bit more focused in how they build. They're not necessarily going to cover everything all at once like a Bard could, but they're great. One of the best classes, and they are going to fulfill so many roles. They don't have great charisma, so they're not really going to be the face of your party, and they don't have great skills. So generally, outside of combat, Clerics don't bring a whole lot to the table, but because wisdom is their primary attribute, they can get a pretty high perception check, which means they're not great at sneaking, but they are pretty good at perception just naturally because of that. And with the right background and things, you might have a reasonable scout out of a cleric. In terms of combat roles, clerics can be a bit of a frontline. They don't have huge hit dice, but they do get great armor. They get medium and shields out of the gate, and depending on your domain, you can get heavy armor and martial weapons as well. They can be an okay striker, specifically the war cleric can do an okay job, and generally speaking, with some of their spells, they can be a pretty solid damage dealing combatant. Definitely though, a blaster. Clerics are potentially one of the most powerful blasters in Dungeons and Dragons when built correctly, specifically the Tempest Cleric. So they have a channel divinity which lets them maximize damage with lightning spells, which means you don't roll, you just multiply your damage by your damage dice for however many dice you have. So a maximized lightning bolt is going to absolutely destroy most encounters. So there is potential to play a blaster, but this is also very much a Nova character. And this is a term in the tabletop game, which is generally they're going to go supernova and they're going to use all their abilities or a combination of abilities to completely end one encounter, but then they're spent. So they can't do this over and over again, but in the right circumstances, they can absolutely become an amazing blaster. Obviously, clerics are good support classes. They have spells like Bless, which is one of the de facto ultimate supporting spells. They're okay controllers. They have some access to spells that can provide some control, and clearly clerics are one of the great healers. So they're going to fill a lot of different roles in combat and can be incredibly versatile. Next up, we have the Druid. As a full caster, Druids once again are incredibly versatile, just like the Bards and the Clerics. You can tell I might have a little bit of a caster bias. I love all the options being a caster provides. So, in terms of non-combat roles, Druids typically won't be the best face because they don't have a lot of charisma, but with animal forms, they can become pretty good scouts in the right circumstances, and definitely capable of becoming specialists. So it really depends on how you build out your character and where you're investing your points into. They're going to have a naturally high wisdom, which gives them that perception, just like the cleric, but they're not necessarily going to be something like a bard or a rogue that's going to be great at finding the traps and things. But, you know, turning into an animal might give you some better dexterity, what might give you some scouting. Definitely in the pen and paper game, they would make amazing scouts, but in this game, there's definitely some cool, unique things the Druid gets to do in terms of non-combat. But generally speaking, in the whole scope of the game, they are probably not the best non-combatants or specialists. In terms of combat roles, this is where Druids shine in their versatility. So with animal shapes, they can easily become an amazing frontliner. They do decent damage to single targets, depending on the form they take. Early on, Druids are absolutely busted when it comes to striking. and they have decent blasting as well. Not the best spell list in terms of doing damage, but definitely capable. They're also amazing when it comes to controlling. They have Entangle, which is one of the best spells when it comes to locking enemies down. It is absolutely amazing. They make fantastic healers. They have all the classic things in terms of Good Berry and things like that for healing. Really, really powerful. Spells like Thorn Whip, even it through a cantrip, gives you some control and being able to pull people around, which is really powerful. Thunder Wave, knocking people off cliffs and things like that. Really, really fun, really, really powerful. So as a support, controlling, healing, blasty character, Druids can do a lot. But like all other spellcasters, they are limited by their spell slots. But unlike other spellcasters, they do get their animal shapes. So they're going to, once they're out of spells, turn into a bear and just maul their enemies to death, or, you know, make sweet love. Fighters. So fighters are generally seen as sort of like the generic character. Here we have our human male fighter, the most common Dungeons and Dragons character of all time. But I'm going to make some arguments that fighters can actually be kind of cool. So yeah, you have your fighting styles and you have great hit points, which is a benefit. You also get great weapons and armor, and you are really good at fighting. So obviously non-combat roles, you're not going to have a ton, but you might be a passable scout as a fighter. You're probably going to have some investment into dexterity, which is going to give you the potential for some stealth, but you know, ideally you're not going to have a fighter be your scout. The one advantage if you are, though, is if you get caught, this is the kind of guy you want on the front line. So unless you're building an archery-focused fighter, fighters are amazing frontliners. And all fighters are also amazing strikers, meaning they're going to do really good damage. And there are quite a few options for some control based on your subclass. So at level 3, when you're picking your specialization a little bit further, you can pick the Eldritch Knight or the Battle Master, and those will give you some options in terms of some controlling. Definitely minor compared to some other characters, but having that clutch spell or having those extra fears or knockbacks are going to be really useful as a fighter. And the nice thing about being a fighter is you don't have spell slots, and your damage is really consistent. Your defenses are really consistent. You're always going to be in peak fighting shape, as it were, as a fighter. So pretty straightforward class, kind of like the Barbarian, but with things like the Battle Master and the Eldritch Knight, you do have a few more tactical options if you like those things in this kind of game. So yeah, not a bad choice. Next we have the Paladin. Paladins are very cool. They are a favored class of many for good reason, because they are both an amazing frontliner, but they're also an amazing party face, because paladins rely on charisma. So this means your big beefy frontliner is also the one going to be talking to people, which is great when those conversations inevitably turn into combats, because then your frontline character is right up in the enemy's face, ready to deal out some justice. So paladins make great faces, but walking around in that heavy armor, they are not going to be scouts, and they don't really have great skills to lead them into being specialists, but they're great at talking to people. In terms of combat, they make excellent frontline damage dealers and defenders, and they are very powerful strikers, with the ability to Nova, kind of like I talked about for the Cleric, for incredible amounts of damage. So specifically using their smites lets them dump their resource into mega damage attacks. So might not be used to this if you're coming from other RPGs, but Paladins actually are sort of the single target nuke masters. They deal some of the most damage in the game, and especially if you're looking to do a really cheesy multi-class, 2 levels of Paladin, and then, you know, the rest of your levels in something like Sorcerer or Warlock can become really, really obnoxious. So Paladins are really great if you want to be a striker and a frontliner, and obviously they also have some healing. So with abilities like Lay on Hands and being a partial caster, they get a few spell slots as well. Paladins can also be a bit of a support character when needed. Next we have the Ranger. So Rangers are sort of the nature equivalent half-caster. If you think of a Paladin as sort of like a Cleric and a fighter, a Ranger is sort of like a Druid and a fighter. They get animal companions. Oftentimes they're seen using bows, but they're also able to use two one-handed weapons to sort of get in there into the thick of things as well. In terms of their non-combat roles, Rangers have excellent dexterity typically, and make absolutely great scouts and potentially even specialists in certain situations. They also use their wisdom for their spell casting, which gives them high perception alongside the excellent stealth, which means Rangers are actually going to be pretty good at detecting traps and finding secret enemies as well. So that's really nice. In terms of their combat roles, Rangers themselves aren't a frontline typically, but they do have animal companions, and just throwing more bodies on the battlefield can help bring up your front line a little bit as well. They make excellent strikers and sharpshooters. They're going to be dealing a lot of damage to single target with Hunter's Mark, and they're going to be absolutely taking out those high threat targets in the enemy backline. They can be an absolute menace to enemy spellcasters, taking them down right away before they can really wreak havoc on the battlefield. So as a striker, Rangers are really powerful. They also have a little bit of control and healing as well. So Rangers, with some of their spells, eventually get spells like Entangle, which can be used in a pinch to control enemies and prevent them from getting to you. And they also have spells that can bring up fallen allies really quickly and easily. So minor healing abilities, a little bit of control, definitely a powerful striker, and their animal companion brings up the front line. Rangers are very fun, and I would recommend this to anyone. I think Rangers are a great class. Next up, we have the Rogue. So this is the classic stealth character, and they excel in non-combat roles. Typically, a Rogue wants their dexterity to be really high, so they're going to be an amazing scout. And because they also get bonuses to certain skill proficiencies, they can fill pretty well any non-combat role fairly well and be a specialist in really any skill you want. So in terms of expertise, that gives you additional proficiency multiplier on certain select skills, which means even if you don't have amazing attributes or ability scores to support a skill, you could still have a really, really high bonus. So for example, you might only have 11 or 12 charisma, but if you put that as your expertise, you'll be chatting away just like the Paladin could, right? So you have a lot of capabilities to specialize your skills. And clearly when it comes to things like picking locks, with your sleight of hand, when it comes to stealth, when it comes to all that kind of stuff, the Rogue is the best scout there is. You are pretty well only rivaled by something like a Bard when it comes to excelling in skills, because Bards also get expertise. In terms of combat roles, Rogues are often a bit of like a skirmisher and definitely play a striker role. They have the unique ability Sneak Attack, which allows them to deal extra damage when they have the upper hand in combat, specifically when enemies are being attacked when the rogue is undetected, or if the enemy is already engaged with the rogue's allies and you're attacking from behind. The rogue does a ton of damage, kind of that classic assassin fantasy of like jumping out of the shadows and dealing a bunch of damage in a single strike. So rogues are really powerful, and like we've mentioned before, unlike the spellcasters, can do a whole bunch of damage repeatedly. They don't necessarily rely on a resource to do that damage, so they're really powerful in that sense. But in terms of combat, they are kind of limited. They really are just going to be a striker. They're kind of too squishy to be a true frontliner. They can be a bit of a ranged assassin as well, but they're not going to be blasting. They don't get multiple attacks, so they're not going to be attacking a whole bunch of different people. You can dual wield and choose where you're using your sneak attack, so to maybe finish off a weak enemy and then sneak attack a high health enemy, but they're not going to be clearing out waves of enemies typically. They don't really have too much in terms of support or control. You can take the Arcane Trickster specialization at level 3, and that'll give you some additional options to get a little bit of controlling. You can get a few spells that can give you a little bit of debuffs and things like that, and those can be pretty useful. But at the end of the day, in terms of combat roles, the Rogue is pretty straightforward. So a pretty fun class to play. A lot of people like that stealth fantasy, and as a skill monkey and that scout character, a great class if you're really into finding all the little secret nooks and crannies in Baldur's Gate. And next up, we have the Sorcerer. So the Sorcerer is a spellcaster that picks their spells sort of ahead of time, and they can fulfill quite a few roles because, like some of the other classes we've already talked about, the Sorcerer's primary stat is Charisma, which means the Sorcerer is an excellent party face. So they are great at Persuasion, Deception, or Intimidation, depending on which you would like to pick. And they also, because they don't really need anything else, tend to have a pretty good dexterity score, because dexterity is sort of the top tier stat of 5th edition, whereas, you know, once you have your main stat, you probably want to put a few points into Constitution and a few points into Dexterity, and that's pretty well true for every single class. So that means Scouting is definitely something they could do, especially augmented with some of their spells. They could be a capable scout, but because they're going to have really low wisdom, they're not really going to spot too many things in terms of having a perception score. So they're not great at that. And they don't have any other standout features that are going to make them amazing as a specialist, but they are a full caster, so your mileage might vary there. In terms of combat roles, you're probably not going to see a sorcerer on the front line, but they do make really powerful blasters. So because sorcerers have a smaller spell pool than a wizard, for example, but they share many spells with them, and they have things called meta magic with sorcery points. Sorcerers are also a class that can truly nova, so they can spend all their sorcery points in high-level spells to completely obliterate encounters, making them, you know, a top-tier blaster, one of the best. So that being said, that's one of the main things they can do. They can also provide some support by buffing allies or debuffing enemies, and they make excellent controllers as well. So they have the ability to manipulate the battlefield, casting things like different spells like Fog or Web to inhibit enemies and give your allies the upper hand. As a full caster in combat, they do get quite a few options, and sorcerers, like most of the full casters, are always a great choice in my opinion, because you're always going to have lots of fun things to do. Moving on, we have the Warlock. This is another fan favorite, I would say. Everybody loves the Warlock. To me, they're a fine class. They're all right in 5th edition. I find the limit of their spell slots makes them a little underwhelming at times, and you might find yourself hitting that short rest button rather often in order to kind of keep going. But the Warlock is sort of like the fighter of spellcasters, or the Barbarian of spellcasters in a sense, because really it all comes down to casting Eldritch Blast. So as long as you like pressing this button, the Warlock's going to be pretty great. But in terms of their actual roles, the Warlock has a high charisma, which means they're going to be fantastic as your party face. They're going to be able to be in the front of your party talking to people, and they'll do a great job there. Like we talked about with a lot of the other classes, they don't make necessarily great scouts, but with the right picks in terms of your subclass, you do have some opportunities to make them into a bit of a specialist in some areas, because you can get some extra proficiencies, especially with some of your invocations. You might get certain proficiencies or the ability to do certain things that you might not otherwise be able to do. So that can be kind of cool. In terms of combat roles, you can play a Warlock as a bit of a Hexblade potentially, be kind of like a skirmisher, and they make excellent strikers. Eldritch Blast is one of the most powerful abilities in the game, and this is why Warlock can sometimes feel a little bit one-dimensional. With the correct invocation that adds your charisma modifier to your damage, Eldritch Blast is generally the best action you're going to take in combat every turn for the whole game. So you're not going to make a ton of tactical decisions in terms of how to spend your action when it comes to the action economy, because pretty well casting Eldritch Blast is the right choice. But it's a good choice. It's very good. It does tons of damage to a single target, and you can even get additional blasts as you level up, so it scales with your level. It has tons of invocations, which lets it push people around, which gives it a little bit of control eventually. And it's amazing. It's a super powerful spell, and it's really fun, and it looks really cool. So yeah, in terms of support and control, you get a few options, mostly around controlling the battlefield with tentacles and knockbacks and darkness and things like that as the Warlock. But because they have such limited spell slots, typically you're going to use your turn as a bonus action. You're going to cast Hex on your target, and then you're just going to keep Eldritch Blasting, and you might use your remaining spell slot to do one controlling spell at some point in the fight. But that's not really your main goal. Typically, you're playing a Warlock because you want to do big damage and get lots of kills, which firmly cements them as a striker, which with also the opportunity to be your party face. And last but certainly not least, we have the Wizard. So the Wizard is one of the coolest classes in terms of spellcasters because, as you can see here, they just get so many spells, and this lets them fulfill quite a few different roles. And typically the niche of the Wizard is being prepared for everything. So in terms of non-combat roles, they don't typically have high charisma, and they don't necessarily have the skill proficiencies or the expertise to be an effective scout, but with a really high intelligence, they can often make reasonable specialists, especially things around arcana or history, religion, for example. All these proficiencies that the game kind of defaults you in, you'll notice have a +5 here. These are all really powerful, and typically the Wizard is the only class that's going to reach these levels in these particular skills. The only other ones being a Bard or potentially a Rogue if they really want to invest their expertise there. So that means they're a pretty good specialist that might give you access to a few areas you might not get otherwise. In terms of combat, you're not typically going to see a Wizard on the front line, but they can pretty well fulfill most other roles. In terms of striking or blasting, they can do decent single target with the right spells. Not amazing, and they will be using a lot of spells. They are going to shine as a blaster, throwing in those fireballs, hitting those enemies, like a whole bunch of enemies at once, for example. And you have spells like Sleep in the early game, and spells like Web that are going to be amazing control spells that can really lock down enemies on the battlefield. So as a controller or support character, I think that's where Wizards shine the best, but you can absolutely play them as a more damage focused character and start blasting and hurling fireballs and lightning bolts and all those classic fantasy Wizard things. So yeah, I hope you enjoyed this overview. I wanted to just give an overview of what different roles each class might be playing. So if you're thinking of putting your party together, you can think about how you want to cover each of these roles and give you some options in how to do it. Thanks for watching, and I will catch you in the next one.